The security cameras didn't glitch. They were killed, deliberately, surgically, by someone who knew exactly where every lens pointed inside Hargrove Memorial Hospital. At 2:13 in the morning, a man in a janitorial uniform reached beneath his cleaning cart and closed his fingers around a suppressed pistol. Nobody screamed, nobody ran. The night shift rolled on. Vitals checked, charts updated, coffee going cold at the nurse's station. Except one person had already seen it coming. Nurse Lena Marsh stood at the end of the corridor, her face unreadable, her hands still, watching three strangers enter through three separate doors. None of them were patients, none of them were staff, and not one of them was carrying anything that belonged in a hospital. Before this night is over, a quiet woman everyone ignored will be the only thing standing between a room full of patients and a professional kill team that has never once failed a contract. If you're new here, subscribe right now because this channel doesn't do ordinary stories. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. You will not want to miss what comes next. The thing about Hargrove Memorial was that it smelled like effort. Not antiseptic, not floor wax, not even the cheap coffee that burned in the break room pot from 6 in the evening until someone finally dumped it at 3 in the morning. It smelled like a building that was always running slightly behind, always a little understaffed, always compensating. The walls in the East Wing still had painter's tape over the baseboards from a renovation that had stalled 4 months ago. The elevator on the second floor made a sound like a tired argument every time the doors tried to close. The hospital was a mid-sized trauma center in Calverton, a city that sat in the flat middle of the country where nothing remarkable ever happened, at least not the kind of remarkable that made the news. Lena Marsh had worked the night shift for 3 years, and she had stopped expecting anything different a long time ago. She was 34, average height, with blonde hair she kept in a low braid because it stayed out of her way. She wore her scrubs the same as everyone else. She moved through the floor quietly, took her assessments seriously, documented everything, asked for nothing. She had a habit of standing slightly to the side of conversations rather than in the center of them, which most of her colleagues interpreted as shyness or social awkwardness, which suited her fine. She had other reasons for watching from the edges. She had always had other reasons. Tonight she was assigned to the East Wing, which ran adjacent to the trauma bay, and she had been on shift for 4 hours when the first thing she noticed didn't match. It was the janitor. Hargrove ran a cleaning crew on nights. 3 people, rotating sections, same faces Lena had learned within her first week on the floor. Older man named Darnell, who hummed country music under his breath. A woman named Petra, who moved fast and didn't talk much. A younger kid, maybe 22, who still hadn't figured out that the mop bucket needed emptying more than once per wing. Lena knew all 3 of them by their walk, by the rhythm of their cartwheels, by the particular sound each one made turning into a hallway. The man pushing the cart past the west entrance supply corridor at 2:09 a.m. was none of them. Lena clocked it without breaking stride. She had a stack of charts in her arm, a pending vitals check on 4B, and a partial IV order she needed to confirm with the attending on duty. She didn't stop. She didn't stare. She turned the corner, set the charts on the nurse's station counter, and stood very still for 4 seconds, running through what she'd seen. Wrong posture. Janitorial staff, especially at this hour, walked with a loose forward lean, the kind that came from hours of pushing carts on hard floors. This man had walked upright, with his weight slightly back, his arms closer to his body than the cart handles required. His boots were wrong, too. Not the soft-soled black shoes Hargrove issued to all facilities staff. These were laced higher, with a slight heel-toe platform that was familiar to Lena in a way that took her approximately 2 seconds to place. Combat boots. Worn, but not scuffed. Well-maintained. She picked up the charts and walked back toward the East Wing like nothing had happened. The charge nurse that night was a woman named Darla Frick, who had been at Hargrove for 11 years and ran the floor with the particular brand of authority that came from knowing exactly how little leverage anyone had over her. She was competent, often unkind, and she had decided within Lena's first month that Lena was decorative, technically proficient, sure, but not someone whose instincts needed to be taken seriously. This conclusion had never been examined or revised. It was simply a fixture of the floor, like the broken elevator and the leftover painter's tape. Lena found her at the station reviewing overnight admissions. "Darla," she kept her voice level. "Do you know if facilities swapped anyone out on the night crew tonight?" Darla didn't look up. Why would I know that? There's someone I don't recognize working the West Corridor. So they hired someone new. Call facilities if you want a roster. I don't have the direct extension. Darla sighed the sigh of someone who had perfected communicating maximum irritation in minimum syllables. Lena, I have 14 active patients, 2 chart discrepancies, and Dr. Holt breathing down my neck about a bed assignment. I don't have time to track janitors for you. She finally looked up. Do your vitals check and let facilities handle facilities. Lena didn't argue. She nodded once and walked away. She passed the elevator, turned left toward the trauma bay, and came up short when she saw the second one. This man wasn't in uniform. I was standing near the family waiting area. One of those people who had mastered the art of looking like they belonged somewhere they didn't, which was a skill. Lena would grant him that. He had a paper coffee cup in one hand and a phone in the other, and from 6 feet away he looked like every other exhausted person who had been sitting in a hospital at 2 in the morning waiting for news about someone they loved. Except his eyes never stayed on the phone. They moved in a pattern. Door. Hallway junction. Nurse station. Trauma bay entrance. Door again. It was fast, deliberate, and automatic. The way someone moved their eyes when they were monitoring sight lines without thinking about it, because monitoring sight lines had become something their nervous system did on its own. Lena walked past him without slowing. She made her way to the trauma bay, pushed through the double doors, and found Dr. Garrett Holt standing over a patient in Bay 4, arguing with a respiratory tech about vent settings. I'm telling you the pressure is wrong, Holt was saying. He was 39, the kind of surgeon who had probably been told he was exceptional so many times that it had calcified into a worldview. He wasn't incompetent. Lena had watched him work and he was genuinely good under pressure, but he mistook being good for being right about everything, which was a different thing entirely. Adjust it. Dr. Holt. Lena pulled his attention before she could second-guess herself. The patient in Bay 4. What do we know about admission circumstances? He turned with the expression of someone whose thought process had just been interrupted by a sound they couldn't immediately categorize. What? The admission. Who brought him in? Ambulance transfer. Trauma to the abdomen. Secondary head laceration. Found unresponsive at a parking structure on Meridian. His eyes sharpened. Why? Does anyone know who he is? ID was on him. Single name card. No insurance, no emergency contacts. Holt looked at her for a beat longer than the question seemed to warrant. Marsh, why are you asking about my patient? I'm trying to understand the intake picture. You're a night shift nurse. The intake picture is above your pay grade. He turned back to the respiratory tech. Fix the pressure. Lena looked past him at the man on the table in Bay 4. He was unconscious, mid-30s, athletically built under the trauma bandaging. The single ID card Holt had mentioned, she could see it clipped to the outside of the chart at the foot of the bed. She didn't pick it up, but she could see the name from where she stood. She also saw the faint, almost invisible scar that ran along the inside of his left forearm, a very specific shape, the kind that came from a very specific kind of deployment injury. She had seen that scar pattern before, in a different time and a different place, on people who did work that didn't get written in reports. She stepped back through the trauma bay doors and pulled out her personal cell phone instead of the hospital line. And she sent a single text to a number she had never deleted and hoped she would never have to use. Unknown package at Hargrove Memorial, Bay 4. Not safe here. Confirm. Then she pocketed the phone, picked up her clipboard, and kept moving. The third man was harder to spot. She almost missed him entirely, which meant he was better than the first two. He was dressed as a medical equipment technician, navy polo, khakis, carrying a clipboard identical to the ones used by the biomedical team that serviced the imaging wing on Monday nights. The detail that tripped him was the direction he was walking. The imaging wing was the opposite direction from the east corridor he was moving through, and the east corridor ended at exactly one thing, the main server and security hub for the hospital's internal camera system. Lena did the math in the time it took her to reach the supply closet at the junction of the east and north corridors, step inside, and close the door behind her. She stood in the dark with her back against the shelving and ran through it clean and fast, the way she had been trained to think when the situation stopped being theoretical. 3 men, 3 separate entrances, 2 in cover identities that required inside knowledge of the hospital's staffing and scheduling, 1 moving directly for the security cameras, none of them medical. all of them with training visible in the small, involuntary physical tells that only someone with the same training would know to look for. They weren't robbing the hospital. There was nothing worth that level of operational coordination in a mid-sized trauma center in Calverton. The only thing in Hargrove Memorial that warranted 3 armed, trained operatives was the unconscious man in Bay 4 with the scar on his arm and a single ID card that she was now certain was not his real name. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at the screen. One word from the number she'd texted. Confirmed. She typed back. How many? 3 seconds. Minimum 3 on site. Extraction team. Do not engage. Secure the package and hold. She stared at that for a moment. Do not engage. She put the phone in her pocket and opened the supply closet door. The east corridor was empty. The camera at the far end was dark. The small red standby light that should have been blinking was off. She hadn't noticed it from the trauma bay. She noticed it now. She had maybe 10 minutes before the whole security grid went down, if it wasn't down already. After that, anyone moving through the hospital would have no external record of where they'd been or what they'd done. She walked back toward the trauma bay at a pace that was slightly faster than her normal, not fast enough to draw attention. Inside, the respiratory tech had left. Holt was on his phone in the corner of the bay, turned away from the patient, talking to someone in the low, irritated voice he used when he was discussing something he didn't want overheard. The patient in Bay 4 was unattended, unconscious, and exposed. Lena picked up the chart, checked the vitals monitors, set the chart down. Then she walked to the Bay 4 curtain, glanced at Holt, still on his phone, still turned away, and said quietly, almost under her breath, to the man on the table, I don't know if you can hear anything right now, but if you can, I need you to know that I know who you are, and I need 3 more minutes to get you somewhere safer. I'm going to move you. Don't fight me. Nothing from the table. Of course nothing. He was out cold. But she said it anyway, because she had learned that the unconscious still sometimes heard, and because it grounded her to say it out loud. She got to the transport handles on the gurney, unlocked the wheel brake, and had begun to move it when Holt ended his call and turned around. What are you doing? Moving him to the isolation bay. She said it evenly, already in motion. Infection control flagged a protocol issue with Bay 4's ventilation. That's the first I'm hearing of it. It came through about 20 minutes ago. I assumed Darla would have updated you. She kept pushing the gurney. I can have her call you if you want to verify. Holt looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of someone running through the probability that she was lying and finding it unlikely, because why would a night shift nurse lie about ventilation protocols? What would she gain? Fine, he said. I'll be in Bay 6. Keep his stats monitored. She moved the patient. The isolation wing was older, quieter, and critically, not on the same camera grid as the main trauma bay. It also had a secondary exit that connected to the hospital's service corridor, which ran out to a loading dock that was, at this hour, unwatched. She got the gurney through the isolation bay door, locked the wheel brake, and rechecked his vitals. Stable. She adjusted the monitor leads, checked the IV line, and then stood at the door and looked back down the corridor. The lights were different. She noticed it with the specific and unwelcome clarity of someone whose senses had shifted into a register she hadn't used in a long time. The corridor wasn't darker, exactly, but the quality of the shadows was wrong. Something had changed in the last 5 minutes. Something in the air pressure of the building. Something in the way the sounds were distributing themselves through the halls. The hospital had gone quieter than it should have been at 2:20 in the morning. Not the ordinary quiet of a slow night shift. A different kind. The kind that preceded something. She was still standing in the doorway when she heard it. A single sharp sound from the direction of the main trauma bay that had no medical explanation. Not a monitor alarm, not equipment, not a door. A suppressed gunshot had a particular acoustic fingerprint. It didn't sound like the movies. It sounded like someone had dropped something heavy and hollow. A brief percussive thud followed by a vibration in the walls that you felt more than heard. Lena had heard the sound before. She stepped back inside the isolation bay, closed the door, and locked it. Then she moved to the emergency panel on the wall, the one for the isolation wing, not the main system. And she manually triggered the soft lockdown protocol for the east and north corridors, mag locks on the fire doors, internal announcement of a hazardous materials spill in progress, non-emergency personnel to shelter in place. The announcement came through the ceiling speakers in the flat, neutral voice of the pre-recorded system. Attention Hargrove Memorial staff. A precautionary isolation protocol is in effect for East and North corridors. All non-essential personnel please remain in designated shelter areas until further notice. It wouldn't stop trained operatives, but it would slow them down by moving civilians out of their path, which meant fewer potential casualties and fewer witnesses in wrong places. And it would funnel anyone moving through those corridors toward the 2 access points she could monitor from where she was standing. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at it. ETA 40 minutes. Keep the package alive. 40 minutes. She did not respond to the text. She set the phone on the supply counter, looked at the man unconscious on the gurney, and took a long breath. She had not been in a situation like this in 3 years. She had left that world deliberately, thoroughly, with the specific intention of never returning to it. She had signed the separation papers, done the exit interviews, packed her things out of the base housing, driven 400 miles to Calverton, enrolled in the civilian nursing program, and built herself a life that was quiet and ordinary and demanded none of the things she had once spent years training herself to do. None of that mattered right now. What mattered was the man on the gurney, his vitals holding, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone who had no idea how much trouble he was in. What mattered was that there were 3 armed people moving through this hospital, and the closest law enforcement response time in this part of Calverton at this hour was somewhere between 12 and 18 minutes, and whoever these people were, they would not wait 12 minutes. She pulled open the supply cabinet on the far wall and did a fast inventory. Standard isolation bay supplies, IV materials, basic surgical tray, 2 portable O2 tanks in the lower cabinet, a crash cart that she sincerely hoped she wouldn't need. She checked the crash cart's contents by muscle memory, running her hands over the equipment with her eyes still on the door. Defibrillator charged, medication stocked. She pulled out 2 of the IV bags and set them on the counter, then repositioned the O2 tanks so they were within reach but not obviously staged. She was tightening the valve on the first tank when the hallway outside the isolation bay went completely dark. Not a power flicker, not a partial outage. Every light in the east corridor simultaneously off. The isolation bay itself stayed lit. It was on a separate emergency circuit. But through the small reinforced glass window in the door, the corridor beyond was black. She heard footsteps. Not the soft, squeaky rubber of hospital footwear. Something harder, quieter, and deliberate. More than one set. She moved away from the window and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, where she would not be visible through the glass. She reached up and switched off the isolation bay's main lights, leaving only the dim standby glow of the patient monitor and the crash cart's indicator lights. Enough to see by. Not enough to illuminate her position through the window. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A pause. She counted it, 4 seconds. Then a voice, low, unhurried, in the register of someone who had never found it necessary to be loud. "We know someone moved him. Room's going to be empty. Check the secondary isolation wing, east side." A second voice, closer to the door. "Lock's engaged." "Bypass it." Lena had maybe 90 seconds before they got through the door lock. She moved back to the patient, checked his IV line one more time out of habit, and then positioned herself between the gurney and the door. She had no weapon. She had 2 portable oxygen tanks, a crash cart, the layout of a room she had just memorized in the dark, and 3 years of trying very hard to forget things she was now going to have to remember. The lock clicked once. A pause. A second click. The door opened. The first man through was moving fast and low, which was the right instinct, and he swept the room with a small tactical light before his eyes had time to adjust, which was also the right instinct, and the beam of the light caught the crash cart and the gurney and the monitor and the far wall before he found what he was looking for. He didn't find Lena, because Lena was not in any of the places his training told him to look first. She came in from his left, the blind side, the side the door had been on, the side he had cleared with the light before he fully entered the room and therefore had mentally filed his safe, and she had the valve of the oxygen tank already moving before he had time to recalibrate. What happened next was fast, unpleasant, and effective. The second man in the doorway had half a second's warning, the sound of the first man going down, which was not a quiet sound, and he started to swing his weapon up, and that was the moment Lena understood with cold, unwelcome clarity that there were not 2 of them, there were 4. The third and fourth were already in the corridor behind him, and one of them had a radio up to his mouth, speaking quickly in a flat professional tone that she could not make out through the sound of her own heartbeat. But the word she caught at the end of it stopped her completely. Perimeter. She dragged the first man inside, got the door closed, jammed the crash cart across it, and stood in the near dark of the isolation bay with her back to the wall and her mind running very fast through a set of numbers. 1 down in the room, 3 outside. 40 minutes, minus however many had already passed. The patient behind her, alive, stable, unaware of any of it. And somewhere in the building, above them, below them, she couldn't tell yet. A sound she had not expected and had no immediate explanation for. A second set of muffled shots coming from the direction of the main entrance, which meant the team hadn't come in through just 3 entry points. They had come in through more. Her phone was on the counter across the room. She made it there in 4 steps and typed one word back to the number that had told her 40 minutes. Faster. The crash cart shifted against the door as the men in the corridor began to push. The crash cart shifted again, harder this time, and Lena put her shoulder into it and held. The men in the corridor weren't panicking. That was the problem. Panicking people made noise, made mistakes, wasted effort. These men were methodical, steady, distributed pressure against the door, testing the resistance, calculating how long it would take to overcome it. She could hear them communicating in short bursts outside, too low to parse, and the sound of it was worse than shouting would have been. She had maybe 2 minutes on the door, maybe less. She looked at the room. Isolation bay, older wing, built in the 1990s when hospital design still accounted for the possibility that patients might need to be separated from the rest of the facility for reasons that weren't just medical. The ceiling tiles were drop panel. The ventilation duct above the sink was larger than the ones in the main wing. She had noticed it 3 weeks ago when she'd helped relocate a patient here and spent 20 minutes waiting for a physician who never showed. She had noticed it the way she noticed a lot of things, without meaning to, without purpose, filing it away without knowing why. She knew why now. She crossed to the patient's gurney, released the wheel brake, and moved it beneath the ventilation panel. Then she climbed on top of the supply counter beside the sink, reached up, and pushed the vent cover in at the upper left corner. The screws on the lower right were the ones that held. The upper left always had play in these older panels, a function of how the mounting brackets corroded, and the cover tilted inward on its remaining hardware. The duct was wide enough, barely. She got back down, moved to the man on the gurney, and did a fast assessment with her hands in the low light. Stable pulse. Airway clear. The IV line was an obstacle, but the bag was half empty and she could disconnect it if she had to. His bandaging was intact. He hadn't moved since she'd repositioned him. Whatever sedative or head trauma or combination of both had put him under was holding, and she needed him to keep holding because what she was about to attempt required him to be approximately cooperative, even in unconsciousness. The crash cart lurched. She heard the sound of a tool, something mechanical, a bypass device on the lock mechanism, not a key. She went back to the gurney, looked at the ceiling, and did the calculation honestly. She was strong. She was trained. She had moved patients in worse circumstances than this, and she had done harder things than this in places that made Hargrove Memorial look like a spa. But she was also alone, working in the dark, with a 200-pound unconscious man and a ventilation duct that was going to require her to get him upright enough to manage the transfer without pulling his IV, destabilizing his head injury, or making enough noise that the men outside heard it over whatever they were doing to the lock. She had perhaps 90 seconds. She disconnected the IV bag and looped it over the top rail of the gurney. She adjusted his cervical position, braced his shoulders, and said quietly, "This is going to be awkward for both of us." Then she started moving. It was not smooth, it was not textbook. She got his upper body elevated and his weight shifted to the edge of the gurney, and she was thinking about the angle of the duct opening when the lock gave. The crash cart moved 6 inches. Lena let the patient back down onto the gurney, controlled, not dropped, stepped away from it, picked up the first oxygen tank from the floor beside the counter, and positioned herself flat against the wall to the hinge side of the door. The crash cart scraped back another 4 inches as the door pushed inward. A hand came through the gap, gloved, reaching for the cart to move it aside, and Lena brought the bottom of the oxygen tank down on the wrist in a single, economical motion that she did not enjoy and did not hesitate over. The sound was bad. The hand withdrew. 2 seconds of recalibration outside. She heard them talking, faster now, and the word she caught this time was clear. Someone being told to go around, which meant they knew about the secondary exit at the back of the isolation wing, which meant she had run out of time to use it herself. She crossed the room, grabbed the second oxygen tank, and went to the secondary exit door. She opened it before whoever was coming around reached it, stepped into the service corridor beyond, and pulled the door almost closed behind her, leaving it open 2 inches, not latched, so it didn't make the sound of a lock engaging. The service corridor was dark and smelled like old concrete and industrial cleaner. It ran the full length of the isolation wing and connected, at the far end, to a stairwell that went down to the basement and up to the second floor. She stood still for 3 seconds and listened. Footsteps, coming from the left. One person, moving quickly, not bothering with quiet anymore because they had decided she was contained and this was retrieval now, not approach. She went right. The stairwell door at the far end was heavy and manual, and she went through it and up, because up was counterintuitive. And she needed counterintuitive right now, taking the stairs 2 at a time in the dark, with one hand on the railing and the oxygen tank in the other, and she reached the second floor landing and stopped. She had left the patient. She stood on the landing and sat with that for exactly 2 seconds, because it needed to be acknowledged, and then it needed to be put somewhere that wasn't the center of her thinking. She had left him because staying in that room would have meant both of them captured, or worse. She had left him because the men outside the door would have a harder time locating an unconscious patient in a locked isolation bay than they'd had locating her, since she'd been the one moving, making noise, creating signal. And she had left him because whoever was on the other end of that text had said 40 minutes, and she needed those 40 minutes to mean something. She checked her phone. 17 minutes had passed since she sent the first message. 23 minutes left. Maybe. Her phone had 1 bar of signal in the stairwell. She typed, "Package stationary, isolation bay east wing. I'm loose. How many on site?" She started moving up the stairs while she waited for the response. The second floor of Hargrove Memorial was the surgical prep and recovery wing, quieter than the floors below, with fewer staff on nights, which meant fewer people in danger and also fewer people who could help her. She pushed through the stairwell door and stood in the corridor and listened. The building's noise had a texture to it now that she was reading differently than she had an hour ago. The intercom system had gone silent. The shelter-in-place announcement had played twice and stopped, which meant either someone had overridden it or the system had been cut at the source. The normal background sounds of the hospital, monitors, carts, the distant percussion of the elevator, were muted in a way that suggested the lockdown had actually worked, and most of the staff were sheltered, which was good, which was what she had wanted. Her phone buzzed. 7 confirmed on site. 2 down? She thought about the man in the isolation bay and the one she'd discouraged at the lock. 2 neutralized, she typed back. 5 mobile, copy. Change in ETA. 15 minutes. Asset is priority 1. Get back to him. She read that twice. 15 minutes now instead of 23. Something had accelerated on their end. She didn't ask what. She typed understood and put the phone back in her pocket. 5 mobile. She had accounted for 2 of the 7, the one in the isolation bay and the one whose wrist she had introduced to the oxygen tank. That left 5 active, somewhere in the building, and at least one of them had been heading around to the secondary exit of the isolation wing, which meant the patient was not as safe as she had hoped. She had to get back downstairs. She turned back toward the stairwell and nearly walked directly into Dr. Garrett Holt, who was standing in the corridor with his phone in his hand and an expression on his face that she had never seen there before. Not arrogance, not irritation, not the particular kind of dismissal he reserved for people he didn't think were worth explaining things to. He looked scared, genuinely, plainly scared, in a way that made him look younger than he was and less certain of everything. "Marsh," his voice was low. "What is happening in this hospital right now? Where are you supposed to be?" "I was in Bay 6 when I heard there were shots. I heard shots." He looked at the oxygen tank in her hand, and his expression moved through several things very quickly. "What is that for? Why do you have that? Are you alone up here?" "Yes. I came up the main stairs when Marsh talked to me. Is this a robbery? Should I be calling 911? I already tried, and the call dropped twice. The cell signal's been partially jammed." She was already thinking past the conversation, already running the floor plan in her head. Stay in the surgical prep room, lock the door from inside, don't open it for anyone until you hear a clear all-staff announcement over the intercom, not a recorded message, a live voice. That's it? That's your instruction? He stared at her. Who are you calling? What are you? Dr. Holt. She said it quietly and clearly. There are armed men in this building who are not here for the hospital. The patient in Bay 4, the transfer from Meridian, is the target. Police response is inbound, but it's going to take time. The best thing you can do right now is stay out of the corridors and keep other staff from moving through them. She paused. Can you do that? He opened his mouth, closed it, and said nothing for a moment. Then, the patient in Bay 4, you moved him. Yes. Where? Isolation Bay, East Wing. He processed this with the look of someone whose mental model of a situation was being revised against his will. I thought you moved him for ventilation protocols. I know. A beat. Then something shifted in his face, not warmth exactly, more like the recalibration of a person who has just discovered that the equation they've been working from had a variable they didn't account for. Okay, he said finally. Surgical prep. I'll keep people in. She nodded and went back through the stairwell door. Going down was faster. She hit the isolation wing service corridor at a run and slowed only when she reached the secondary exit door, the one she'd left 2 inches open, and saw that it was now fully closed. She stopped, listened. The door being closed meant one of two things. Someone had come through it from the corridor side and pulled it shut behind them, or the wind pressure from the stairwell had pushed it closed when she'd gone up. The service corridor she was standing in had a slight draft from the HVAC return, and she had felt it when she first came through. Possible. Possible it was just the door. She put her hand flat on the door and felt the vibration of the building through it for 3 seconds. Nothing she could read. She opened the door. The isolation bay was dark. The monitor at the bedside was still running. She could see the green trace of the patient's heartbeat on the screen, which meant the leads were still attached, which meant no one had moved him. She crossed to the gurney in 4 steps and checked him by touch. Pulse at the carotid, airway, the bandaging on his abdomen. Stable. All of it. He was still here and still alive, and she let herself have half a second of relief before she heard breathing that wasn't his. She went still. The room had 4 corners. She was standing at the north end near the gurney. The door she'd come in through was behind her to the south. The supply cabinet was to her left, and to her right was the original entry door, the one she'd barricaded with the crash cart. The crash cart was no longer against the door. It was 6 feet from where she'd left it, moved aside, and the door behind it was closed and locked from the inside. There was someone else in the room. She didn't turn toward the breathing. She moved laterally toward the supply cabinet, keeping the gurney between herself and the corner she'd identified the sound as coming from, and she said without raising her voice, I know you're there, and I need you to know that the last person who came through that door left without full use of their right hand. So let's establish some things before you do something we both regret. A pause. Then a voice from the far corner, low and male, and with the particular flat effect of someone working very hard to sound calm. Who are you? I'm the nurse who moved your guy. Who are you? Another pause, longer this time. Travis Wick. A sound of movement, slow, deliberate, the sound of someone lowering a weapon rather than raising one, which she noted. I'm on his protection detail, or I was, until 40 minutes ago when everything went sideways. Where were you when it went sideways? Parking structure. They hit the vehicle before we even got him inside. I got him to the ambulance and I got separated. He paused. I've been trying to reach him for an hour. How many of you were on the detail originally? 4. I don't know where the other 3 are. She considered this. You have ID? In my jacket. Show me. He came out of the corner slowly, and she got her first look at him in the monitor's green light. Mid-30s, compact, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been hit recently and was managing it. She could see it in his left shoulder, the way he was favoring it, the set of his jaw. He reached into his jacket with his right hand and produced a credentials wallet, which he held open toward her. She didn't take it. She read it from where she was standing. The name and the agency were real. She'd seen enough of both to know the difference between a genuine credential and a manufactured one, and this was genuine. The photo matched. Okay, she said. Wick, there are 5 active hostiles still in the building. Backup is 12 minutes out. I need you to tell me everything you know about who sent these people and how many we're actually dealing with. He lowered the credential wallet. You said 12 minutes. Who's coming? People who want your principal alive. He looked at the man on the gurney. Something crossed his face that wasn't tactical. Something more personal. The particular strain of someone who had failed at the specific job they were given and was still processing what that meant. He was conscious when I got him to the ambulance. He told me something. He stopped. Tell me. He said if anything went wrong, the most important thing was that a drive got to a federal contact in Denver. He had it on him when he came in. Small, black, looks like a medical device reader. Lena's eyes went to the chart at the foot of the gurney. The personal effects bag clipped to the lower rail. She crossed to it, opened it, and went through it with one hand. Wallet. The fake one. Phone, cracked screen. A pen. A folded piece of paper. And a small black rectangular device, approximately the size and shape of a thumb drive with a medical reader casing around it. She held it up. Wick exhaled. That's it. She turned it over in her fingers. Whatever was on this, whatever information this man had been carrying when he went down in that parking structure, whatever had been worth sending a 7-person kill team into a civilian hospital in the middle of the night to recover or destroy. It was small enough to fit in her palm and light enough that she barely felt the weight of it. She put it in her scrubs pocket. It stays with me, she said. Not because I don't trust you, because if they get through that door again, I need to be the one moving and I'm harder to catch than a gurney. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone recalculating, adding up details they'd observed, and arriving at a sum that didn't match the category they'd started with. Night shift nurse. Quiet blonde. Moved the patient, barricaded the door, took out 2 trained operatives with an oxygen tank and a knowledge of door hinges. What's your background? He asked. Current background is RN, Hargrove Memorial Hospital, East Wing night shift. She moved to the door and checked the lock. Previous background is none of your business right now. A sound from the corridor outside stopped the conversation. Not footsteps this time. Something heavier, something dragged, or something dropped, followed by a voice she hadn't heard before. Different from the others. Older, more deliberate, with the particular quality of a voice that was accustomed to being the one that ended discussions. We know the nurse moved him. We know she's still in the building. The drive is with her. Coulter didn't get it before she relocated the asset. A pause. New protocol. We don't need the asset anymore. We need the drive and we need her eliminated. Quietly if possible. We're already past quietly. Wick looked at her. She looked at the door. Coulter, she said quietly. That's the one I left in the room. He's mobile? Apparently. She thought fast. The voice. Who is that? I don't know. He hesitated, and she could see him deciding something. But the operational profile, the coordination, the camera suppression, the vehicle hit before we even reached the hospital. That's not a freelance crew. That's contracted. Someone with real resources built this. Any idea who? The man on that gurney spent 6 months building a case against someone with connections to 3 federal agencies and 4 private military contractors. Wick paused. Take your pick. The voice in the corridor spoke again, closer now. East Wing, isolation bay. Stack up. Lena moved. She crossed to the crash cart, pulled the defibrillator free from its mounting, and ran a fast check. Charged, operational, leads intact. She set it on the supply counter. Then she went to the supply cabinet and pulled out everything on the second shelf. IV bags, tubing, packaging materials, and began rearranging the cabinet's interior with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had stopped being afraid and moved into the place on the other side of fear where everything became very clear and very simple. What are you doing? Wick asked. Buying time. She didn't stop moving. Can you stand post at the secondary exit? Not to engage, to tell me if the door moves. He crossed to the service corridor door without another word, which she appreciated. She finished with the supply cabinet, stepped back, and looked at the room. The green trace on the monitor. The man on the gurney who had no idea any of this was happening. The device in her pocket, whatever it contained, whatever it was worth in lives and money to the people stacking up outside. She thought about the voice in the corridor, the older, deliberate one. the one that had said eliminate like it was an administrative decision. She thought about the fact that 12 minutes had sounded like a long time when Wick first walked out of the corner, and now it sounded like a very long time indeed. "Wick," she said quietly. "Yeah." "The secondary exit. Does it open out or in?" "Out." "Is there anything on the other side of it that burns?" A pause. "There's a janitorial supply room about 15 feet down the corridor, industrial cleaning chemicals." She nodded slowly. She wasn't going to set anything on fire. She wasn't in the business of burning hospitals down. But the men outside didn't know that, and a threat only needed to be credible, not real. And sometimes the difference between walking into a room and deciding to wait for different odds came down to one person's willingness to make the math worse for everyone. She pulled out her phone. 1 bar. She typed fast. "ETA update. They're at the door. Drive is secure with me. Asset is stable." She hit send and looked up. The isolation bay door handle moved, tested, slow, from the outside. Then the voice, right against the door this time, close enough that she could hear the slight roughness in it that suggested the man had been talking for a long time tonight and was running low on patience. "Whoever is in that room, I'm going to tell you something honest. The man on the table is not your concern. Whatever you think you know about him, it's less than you think. The device in your pocket is worth more than this hospital, more than this city, and the people who want it back are not going to stop at a locked door." A pause. "Open it. Walk out. We'll consider the whole situation resolved. You have 30 seconds. Lena looked at the door. She looked at the patient on the gurney. She looked at the device-shaped weight in her scrub's pocket. Then she said, clearly enough to be heard through the door, "I've got a defibrillator charged to 360 joules, 2 compromised oxygen lines that I've already opened into the ventilation return, and your guy Coulter's gun, which I took when he was too busy not having a functional wrist to notice." She paused. "I also have a contact who is going to be very interested in the voice print I just recorded on my phone. So here's my counteroffer. You take your remaining people and you pull back to the main entrance and you wait. Because in about 11 minutes, a conversation is going to start that you are not going to want to be in the middle of." She had none of those things except the defibrillator and the recording, which she had in fact been running since Wick identified himself. But the oxygen lines were possible, and they didn't know what she'd done in the 8 minutes she'd been alone in the room, and the gun was a reasonable guess, because Coulter had been in the room, and she'd been in the room, and only one of them had left voluntarily. Silence from the corridor, 7 seconds of it, then footsteps, not approaching, moving away. She did not relax. She did not take it as retreat. She took it as adjustment, as someone buying their own time while they reconsidered the equation. And she used those seconds to move to Wick's position at the secondary exit and say quietly, "If they go around, they go for the loading dock. Can you hold that if they come through?" "Depends on how many." "2 at most. The rest will stay on the primary." He nodded. She could see him managing the shoulder, the way he was holding his left arm slightly forward to keep the joint from rotating. How was functional but not at full capacity, which meant she needed to be careful about what she put him on. "Hold the door," she said. "Don't open it. If they try to come through, make noise. I'll come to you." She went back to the gurney and stood over the patient and checked his pulse again, strong, steady, and found herself thinking, not for the first time tonight, about the file she had left when she left the service. The paperwork she had signed. The very clear language in the separation agreement about resuming activities related to her prior role. None of it had a clause for this. None of it had anticipated a Tuesday night in Calverton where a kill team walked into a hospital she happened to work in, and the only person who saw it coming was a woman who had spent 3 years trying to convince herself that her old life was behind her. She looked at the monitor screen. Green trace, steady rhythm, 61 beats per minute. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The message was 4 words, from the number she'd been texting all night. 8 minutes. Hold on. She looked up from the phone. From the main corridor. Not the secondary exit. Not the door in front of her, but from somewhere above her, from the ceiling of the isolation wing, from the ventilation system she had opened 20 minutes ago and then abandoned when the lock gave, she heard a sound that her body understood before her mind caught up with it. The soft, specific sound of something being threaded through a duct. And then Wick said, from across the room, very quietly, "Marsh." She turned. The secondary exit door was moving, not from a push, not from a tool on the lock, It was moving because someone on the other side had a key, and the handle was turning with the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who had always had a key and had been waiting for the right moment to use it. The handle completed its turn, and the door opened inward 3 inches before Wick hit it with his shoulder. The impact was solid, 200 pounds of forward momentum against a door that was already moving, and whoever was on the other side hadn't been braced for resistance. There was a grunt, a scramble of boots on concrete, and Wick got the door closed again and put his back against it and looked at Lena with an expression that communicated, without any words at all, that his shoulder had not enjoyed that. "More than one?" she asked. "Felt like 2. She crossed the room to him, looked at the door, and made a decision she didn't love. "Move. Marsh, I need you on the gurney brake and monitoring the primary door. Can you do that?" He pushed off the door and she took his place, back flat against the metal, both hands on the push bar. Through the door she could feel them reorganizing. The slight change in pressure as they repositioned, the scrape of a boot finding purchase on the concrete floor of the service corridor. They weren't going to ram it. They were going to do something smarter than ram it, which meant she had less time than she thought. She had been in situations where she was the smallest variable in the room. She had learned a long time ago and at considerable cost that being the smallest variable was not the same as being the least important one. The men outside were larger, probably faster in open space, certainly better armed. What they didn't have was the floor plan loaded in her head, the specific texture of this wing's infrastructure, or 7 years of making critical decisions under conditions that would have broken most people in the first 6 months. She reached back and found the push bar latch with her right hand without looking. Industrial fire door, older model. The push bar had a manual pin lock at the bottom, a floor-mounted bolt that required a key from the outside but could be engaged manually from inside. She had seen it when she first came through. She hadn't had a free hand to use it then. She dropped to one knee, found the bolt by touch, and drove it home. The door went rigid against her back. She stood and walked to the gurney. Wick had the wheel brake locked and was watching the primary door from 6 feet back, left arm held close to his body. She checked the patient, vitals unchanged, still under, and then went to the supply counter and picked up her phone. 6 minutes on the ETA. She was not going to text again. They knew what they needed to know, and she needed the phone's battery for the recording she was still running. The voice from the corridor, she said to Wick, keeping it low. He pulled back. Tactical pause, he's repositioning. Agreed. Which way does he come? Wick was quiet for a moment. Ceiling. She had thought the same thing. The sound she'd heard in the vent, threading, careful, someone who knew ductwork. That had been 3 minutes ago. And either it was one of the exterior team moving into position through the ventilation system, or it was something she hadn't accounted for yet. The ceiling tiles in the isolation wing were drop panel, same as the rest of the older wing, and a drop panel ceiling above a room you needed to enter was not a ceiling at all. It was a door that faced a different direction. She looked up. The tiles were in a standard grid, 12 of them across the ceiling, 8 inches of clearance above them to the concrete deck, and the HVAC duct she had opened earlier on the sink side. She hadn't closed it. She had tilted the cover back in, but she hadn't reset the hardware, and anyone who had found that duct from the outside would know within 30 seconds that it had been recently accessed. She put the oxygen tank on the supply counter directly below the open vent, upright, valve side up. "What is that going to do?" Wick asked. "Nothing, if I'm wrong about where they come through." She moved to the crash cart and took the charged defibrillator in both hands, full unit, paddles extended. But if they come through the vent above the sink, they're going to be in a narrow space with their weight on their hands, which means they're not going to be in a position to manage much of anything else for about 2 seconds. 2 seconds it's enough. He didn't argue. She positioned herself to the left of the sink, back against the supply cabinet, defibrillator in her hands, and they waited. The primary door remained closed. The secondary exit held. The room was quiet except for the monitor beeping and the particular sound of 2 people breathing at slightly different rates, managing different levels of pain and adrenaline, and the specific cognitive weight of knowing that time was collapsing toward a point they couldn't fully see yet. The tile above the sink shifted. It was subtle, a 1/4 inch, the kind of movement that produced almost no sound at all. Lena had been watching that specific tile for 90 seconds, and she saw it before she heard it. She did not move. She did not look away. The tile shifted again, this time lifting at one corner, and a gloved hand appeared in the gap. Lena waited until the hand had found the vent opening and was bearing weight, and then she reached up and opened the oxygen tank valve all the way. The hiss of pressurized oxygen into an enclosed space above a drop panel ceiling was not dramatic. It was quiet and immediate, and it filled the space above the tiles in approximately 4 seconds. And the person in the duct above her coughed once, sharp, involuntary, the kind of cough you couldn't suppress because your body did it without asking. And that was all the confirmation she needed. She stepped back from the sink. The tile came down hard. Not a controlled entry, a fall. The man came through it wrong, off balance, one arm leading, and he hit the supply counter instead of the floor, and the impact made a sound that she felt in her back teeth. He was moving again within 2 seconds, which meant he was good. But in those 2 seconds, she had stepped in and taken his weapon arm and introduced his face to the supply counter from a different angle and held him there until he stopped making decisions. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. Her left hand was shaking slightly, the way it sometimes did after the specific combination of adrenaline and physical effort that her body still hadn't entirely adapted to, even with everything she'd put it through. She noted the shake and set it aside. She secured the man's hands with IV tubing, not ideal, not permanent, but enough, and looked at Wick. Primary door, now. He was already there. A noise from beyond the primary door, not a voice, not a tool. Something heavier. A thud, then another, then a third. Not a battering ram, something more deliberate, working at a specific point in the door frame near the upper hinge, which was the weakest point in this style of door because the mounting hardware was original and the screws had been painted over twice without anyone checking the thread integrity. Lena crossed the room, looked at the door, and made the calculation. The hinge was going to go in approximately 60 seconds. The upper hinge, not the lower. The door would torque outward at the top and inward at the bottom, and anyone in the room who was standing directly in front of it would have a bad moment. She positioned herself to the right side, put Wick to the left, and looked at the patient on the gurney. "Move him back," she said. "Corner, away from the door axis." Wick released the brake and rolled the gurney back and to the left with his one good arm, grunting with the effort, and got it into the far corner. The hinge gave. The door did exactly what she'd calculated, torqued outward at the top, the hinge side swinging free while the lock side held, and the man who came through first had to duck under the falling top edge, and that cost him his sight line for 1 full second, which was the second Lena used to step forward and establish contact. She was not trying to be elegant. Elegance was for situations where you had resources. She had a charged defibrillator, knowledge of where every piece of equipment in this room was in the dark, and 11 years of training that she had never fully managed to put down, regardless of how many times she'd signed paperwork saying she had. The second man through the door was faster than the first, and had anticipated the door problem and came in lower. And she caught him in a way that was genuinely unpleasant for both of them, because she didn't have the angle she wanted, and what worked was a function of stubbornness as much as technique. She came away from it with a bruised forearm and something wrong in 2 of her fingers on her right hand, and he came away from it unable to contribute further to the operation, and she was willing to call that an acceptable exchange rate. The room went quiet. 4 seconds of it. Then the voice from the corridor, the older, deliberate one, said, from a distance that suggested he had not come forward with his team, which told her something important about his risk assessment. "That's 4 of mine." Lena stood in the wrecked isolation bay with the door hanging off one hinge and her right hand not working the way it should and said, "You want to rethink the math?" A pause. "What I want," the voice said, "is the drive. I don't actually care about the nurse or the compromised asset. Walk the drive to the corridor door and set it on the floor, and everyone in that room sees tomorrow. You've already tried the honest approach once tonight. It didn't land." That was a different offer. Something in his voice changed, not softer, but more direct, the way a person got when they stopped performing patience and started meaning it. "You don't know what's on that drive. You don't know what it costs to let it reach the wrong people. Think about what you're protecting." "I know exactly what I'm protecting," she said. "It's the same thing I've always protected." She paused. "You have maybe 4 minutes before this gets complicated for you." Silence. Then footsteps, not toward the room, away from it, moving fast. She did not trust it. She turned to Wick and said, "Stay here. Do not open any door. Do not let anyone in except people with credentials you can verify. If the monitor alarms, you know basic airway management? Yes. Good. She picked up the weapon she'd pulled from the man who'd come through the ceiling, checked it, found it loaded, safetied, and moved toward the broken door. You're going after him, Wick said. He's going for an exit. If he gets out of the building with his people before backup arrives, we lose the chain of accountability. Everything on that drive becomes a dead letter without the person who ordered the operation to contextualize it. She looked back at Wick once. 4 minutes. Hold the room. She went into the corridor. The east wing at 2:47 in the morning was a specific kind of dark. Not complete, because the emergency lighting strips along the floor were still functional on a separate circuit, but low enough that the shadows between them had real depth. She moved through them the way she had been taught to move through darkness a long time ago, which was to stop fighting it and let it be the same thing on both sides. The corridor was empty. She could hear the voice from somewhere ahead. Not words, a radio transmission, brief and encoded, and she followed the sound left at the junction toward the main corridor that ran toward the hospital's west entrance. She found the third man she hadn't accounted for in the housekeeping alcove, the one in janitorial uniform from the start of the night, the one whose wrong posture she had clocked at 2:09. He was alive, sitting against the wall, and from the look of him he had been there for a while. Zip-tied at the wrists, a bruise developing across his jaw. Not her work. She stopped, crouched. Who did this? He looked at her with the careful eyes of someone who was deciding how much information the current situation warranted sharing. Didn't see his face, came from behind at the West Junction about 40 minutes ago. He say anything? Said to stay down and stay quiet. She stood. That was Wick's account of his timeline. He'd been separated from the protective detail before the patient arrived. But if someone had taken this man down 40 minutes ago, it wasn't Wick. Wick had been in the service corridor when she found him. There was a fourth member of the protective detail still unaccounted for. She filed it and kept moving. The West Junction gave her a sight line all the way to the main entrance, and what she saw when she reached it stopped her completely. The older man, the voice, was standing at the hospital's main entrance lobby, 20 meters ahead of her, and he was not trying to leave. He was standing still, facing the exterior doors, and he had a phone to his ear and his posture had changed from everything she'd read in it through a door. It was tight, compressed, the posture of someone receiving information they had not wanted to receive. She moved along the wall, keeping to the shadow above the floor emergency strips, and got close enough to hear fragments. Perimeter is compromised. How many? A pause. That's not possible. The window was... Another pause. Longer. He lowered the phone slowly, and she could see his face in the ambient light from the lobby's exterior windows. Late 50s, square jaw, the kind of face that had made a career of being unreadable and had mostly succeeded. He turned and saw her. They stood 15 feet apart in the lobby of Hargrove Memorial Hospital at 2:49 in the morning, and neither of them moved. You made the call, he said. It wasn't a question. I made several calls tonight. The military distress signal, through the hospital's emergency radio system. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who had just added a column of numbers and arrived at a total he didn't like. You had access to the emergency radio. It's in the charge nurse station. The code is the same one they've used for 3 years. Nobody changes codes in hospitals. She kept the weapon at her side, not raised. Who are you? Does it matter? For the recording I've been running since you first spoke through the door. Yes. Something moved across his face. Not fear. She didn't think this man did fear in any conventional sense. More like a form of professional acknowledgement, the way a chess player looked when they realized they'd been a move behind for longer than they'd understood. Marcus Reeve, he said, formerly of the Defense Procurement Office. Currently, he paused. Currently in a complicated position. The man in Bay 4, he built a case against you. Reeve said nothing. 6 months, she continued, connections to federal agencies and private military contractors. That's what I was told. And you couldn't let whatever is on that drive reach anyone who could use it. She watched him. How many people knew about it before tonight? Fewer than you'd think. His voice was level. That's always the problem with these things. Too few people knowing, and then suddenly the wrong one does. He wasn't the wrong one. He was exactly the right one. Perspective, Reeve said. From outside, distant, still, but unmistakably real, she heard it. The sound she had been listening for since she sent the first text. Not the thump of a helicopter. The particular acoustic signature of rotors cutting air at low altitude over a flat urban landscape, the sound spreading out and flattening as it descended. More than one aircraft. Reeve heard it too. He looked toward the exterior doors. "You have maybe 90 seconds," she said. "You can run. You probably won't make it. Or you can wait." He turned back to her. His jaw worked once. "I've been in this business for 31 years, he said. "I have never once been caught." "There's a first time," she said, "for everything." The exterior doors of Hargrove Memorial blew open. Not from an explosion, from a team moving through them at speed, 2 columns, the kind of coordinated entry that required months of practice and looked effortless only because of how much work had gone into making it look that way. Black tactical gear, no visible unit insignia, weapons up and moving in practiced arcs. And at their center a man who was moving faster than the rest of them without appearing to hurry. 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, a face that had about 12 years on Lena and wore all of them in the set of his eyes. He saw Lena first. He stopped. The team fanned out through the lobby, 2 peeling off toward Reeve with weapons leveled, and the man at the center walked to Lena at a pace that was no longer tactical. It was something else, something she couldn't fully categorize. The pace of a person crossing a room because they needed to be certain of something with their own eyes. He stopped 4 feet from her. "Marsh." "Commander Taft." He looked at her for a moment, actually looked at her, the way very few people had looked at her in the last 3 years. Not as a night shift nurse, not as a background figure, not as someone to be managed or redirected. He looked at her the way people looked at each other when they had been through things together that neither of them could fully talk about afterward. "Package?" he said. "Isolation bay, East Wing, stable. Detail member Wick is with him." She reached into her scrubs pocket and held out the drive. "This is what they were after." He took it, looked at it once, passed it to the operative on his left without looking away from Lena. "You've been alone in here for 42 minutes, she paused. "Give or take." "How many?" 7 on site. 2 in the isolation bay, 1 in the vent, 2 at the primary door, 1 in the housekeeping alcove. She glanced toward Reeve, who was being cuffed by 2 of Taft's people with a composure that was, she had to admit, impressive. "And him." Taft followed her glance. "You know who he is?" "Marcus Reeve, he told me himself, former defense procurement. Current," she used his own word back, "complicated position." Something crossed Taft's face that wasn't quite a smile, a compression at the corners of his mouth, the expression of someone who had just received a piece of information that resolved something they had been working on for a long time. "Reeve," he said quietly, to himself more than to her. Then he looked back. "How are you?" It was such a specific question. Not "are you hurt or do you need medical?" Just "how are you?" The question you asked someone when you understood that the situation they had just navigated was not simply physical. "I'm standing," she said. "Your hand." She looked down. She had forgotten about the fingers. 2 of them on the right hand were swelling along the proximal joints, the skin pulling tight and pale at the knuckle. She could move them, which meant fracture was possible but not certain. She had been moving without thinking about it for the last 15 minutes, which was the way adrenaline worked. It delayed the accounting, let you run a tab, and presented the bill when you stopped. "It can wait," she said. "Marsh." He said her name with a particular kind of weight that she recognized from years of working under him, the weight of a senior officer who was choosing his next words with care. "We got the signal from the hospital's emergency radio, the distress code." He paused. "You remembered it." "I remembered a lot of things tonight that I would have preferred not to." He looked at her for another moment. "The patient in Bay 4, he said. "His name is Vincent Okar. He's been under deep cover for 14 months building a case that we have been trying to build for 6 years. The drive he carried contains recorded communications, financial transfer documentation, and sworn affidavits from 3 corroborating sources." He stopped. "If he had died tonight, or if that drive had been taken—" "He didn't," she said. "And it wasn't." Taft nodded once. There was something in his face that she didn't look at directly, because looking at it directly would have cost her something. She wasn't ready to spend right now, in this lobby, With her hands swelling and the adrenaline starting to recede, and 3 years of a quiet, ordinary life sitting somewhere in the back of her mind, asking complicated questions. "I need to get back to Bay 4, she said. "I need to check on my patient." Marsh, he's still in there with a head laceration and abdominal trauma and a detail member who is managing a separated shoulder, and I left them about 7 minutes ago, so. She started walking. She heard Taft behind her, not stopping her, falling in beside her, which was what he had done for years when there was work to do. Not leading, not deferring, just keeping pace. They moved through the east corridor together, past the wrecked isolation bay door, and she pushed inside to find Wick sitting on the supply counter with his arm cradled and the patient's monitor still running its steady green trace, and the man she'd pulled from the ceiling secured in the far corner with what looked like considerably more IV tubing than she'd used originally. "Taft," Wick said, and his whole face changed. "Wick." Taft crossed to him. "The shoulder. Manageable." He looked at Lena. "She's the reason he's alive." "I know," Taft said. Lena moved to the patient, to Vincent Okar, who had a name now, and ran through a fast assessment. Pulse 63, blood pressure had drifted slightly low, airway clear. The head laceration had bled through the dressing on one edge, and she replaced it, working with her left hand where she could, using the right carefully when she had to. "He needs a neurology consult and a repeat CT," she said. "The BP drift needs to be watched. I want a fresh unit of saline, and I want him monitored every 15 minutes. Nobody in the room questioned it. She completed the dressing, rechecked the leads, and stood back. Her hands were shaking now, both of them. The right more than the left, but both. She had known this would come. The delayed physiological response, the system reclaiming what it had borrowed from her for the last 45 minutes. And she had known she couldn't stop it, only manage when it arrived. She put her hands in the pocket of her scrubs and stood at the foot of the gurney and breathed. Behind her, Taft was on his radio, coordinating the sweep of the remaining wing sections, and Wick was being assessed by one of the tactical medics who had come in with the team, and the hospital's intercom was coming back online. She could hear the system cycling through its startup sequence, the preliminary tone before the live announcement that would tell the sheltered staff it was over. Over. She had walked into this shift 4 hours ago carrying a stack of patient charts and a cup of coffee she'd never finished. She was walking out of it, whenever she walked out of it, with 2 fractured fingers, a recording of Marcus Reeves saying his own name, a man alive on a gurney who had been 2 minutes from being dead, and the specific, particular exhaustion that came not from exertion, but from the act of becoming, for one night, the person she had spent 3 years trying to stop being. One of the tactical team members stepped into the isolation bay doorway and said, "Commander Taft, we've got a problem with the west stairwell, 3rd floor." Taft was on his feet before the sentence finished. He looked at Lena once. "Stay here," he said. "I am staying here," she said. "I'm a nurse. This is my patient." He moved. The tactical member moved with him. 2 more from the corridor outside went with them in the direction of the west stairwell, and the hallway emptied quickly in the way it only did when the people moving through it had a specific problem to address. Lena stood in the isolation bay in the relative quiet. Wick said, from the counter, "The 4th member of the detail, Reyes. She's been unaccounted for all night." Lena looked at him. "She went in ahead of the convoy this afternoon," he said. "Advance work. We lost contact around 8 p.m. I thought—" He stopped. "I assumed the worst." "The man in the housekeeping alcove," Lena said slowly, "zip-tied, said someone hit him from behind 40 minutes ago, didn't see a face." Wick's expression shifted. "That could be—" From the west stairwell, somewhere above them, she heard 3 things in rapid succession. A single shout, a sound of impact, and then Taft's voice, carrying down through the building's infrastructure with the particular carrying quality of someone who was not shouting but projecting, the voice of a person who had been trained to be heard across distance and noise. "Friendly, stand down, stand down." Then a second voice, female, hoarse, with the worn edge of someone who had been holding on for a long time and had just run out of the need to. "Taft, I've got Reeves' operations coordinator. He's been running the building's override system from the 3rd floor since midnight." Silence on the radio. Then Taft, steady. "Copy. Secure him and hold." Lena sat down on the edge of the supply counter because her legs had decided to have an opinion. She sat there for a moment in the hum and beep of the monitor, with Wick across from her and Vincent Okar, alive and breathing behind her, and the whole building slowly, tentatively, beginning to normalize around the fact of what had happened inside it tonight. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. Not the number she'd been texting, a different one. The message was short. Marsh. We need to talk about what comes next. Taft. She stared at the message. Then, from the room's single small window, high on the wall, narrow, looking out at the eastern sky, she saw something she had not expected and was not prepared for. The first gray edge of dawn, barely, just barely, beginning to separate itself from the dark. 4 hours. That was all it had been. She put the phone face down on the counter and went back to check her patient's vitals for the 4th time, because that was the job, and the job was still the job, and the message from Taft would be there when she was done. But before she reached the gurney, the intercom overhead crackled. Not the recorded shelter-in-place message, but a live voice, uncertain, the voice of someone at the charge station who was reading from something they'd just been handed. And the voice said, "All staff, all units, this is a direct all clear. Hargrove Memorial is secure. Emergency services are on site. All personnel may resume normal movement. This is a live announcement." A pause. "All staff, please return to your stations." Lena listened to it. Then from down the corridor, moving fast and not bothering to moderate his volume the way he normally did when he thought it mattered what people thought of him, she heard Dr. Garrett Holt say, "Marsh, Marsh, where are—" And then he came through the broken doorway and stopped, taking in the state of the room with the specific expression of a man who had spent 6 hours in surgical prep trying to make sense of sounds he couldn't interpret, and now was standing in front of the interpretation and finding it considerably worse than anything he had imagined. He looked at the patient. He looked at Wick. He looked at the man secured in the corner with IV tubing. He looked at the broken door hanging at its angle. Then he looked at Lena. She looked back at him. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said quietly, which was not a register she had heard from him before, "Are you hurt?" "2 fingers, probably fractured." "I'll get the—" "After you check your patient," she said. "BP's drifted low and I want a neurology consult on the head injury." He looked at the patient for another half-second. Then he walked to the gurney and began his assessment without another word, and she moved aside to give him room, and they worked in the same space without discussing it, him doing what she had asked and her managing the IV line on the side he couldn't reach. And it was not comfortable exactly, and it was not resolved, but it was functional, and sometimes that was what the situation asked for, and you gave it. From the doorway, one of Taft's team members said, "Marsh, Commander Taft is requesting you in the west stairwell, 3rd floor. When you're clear." She looked at Holt. He nodded without looking up from the patient, which was its own kind of answer. She walked toward the door. She was 3 steps into the corridor when her phone buzzed again. Different number this time. She almost didn't look at it, and then she did, and she stopped walking. The text was from a number she had never seen before. No name, no context. Just a message of 11 words that made the floor feel suddenly less certain under her feet. "We know you have the drive. You can't protect everyone." She read the message twice. 11 words. No sender identification. No threat elaboration. Just the fact of it, delivered to a number that was not her work phone, not her personal line. It was the phone she had used to contact Taft's number earlier, the one she carried for reasons she had told herself were precautionary and had not examined too closely in 3 years. Someone knew that number, which meant someone knew considerably more than the 7 people who had come through the hospital tonight, because none of them had been in a position to send anything since Taft's team arrived. She had the recording. She had the drive. She had Reeve in custody on the lobby floor, 7 operatives neutralized or secured, and someone outside this building right now was watching. She did not run. Running communicated information she wasn't ready to give. She walked back to the isolation bay doorway and said to Holt, "I need you to listen to me very carefully for about 30 seconds. He looked up from the patient. "There may be additional surveillance on this building. External. I don't know the scope yet." She kept her voice flat and specific. No alarm, no uncertainty in the delivery, just the information. "I need this room locked down from inside. No one in or out except Taft's people, and you verify credentials before you open the door. Wick can tell you what a valid credential looks like." Holt stared at her. You just told me it was over. I told you the building was secure. That's different from over. She looked at Wick. You have your credentials? On me. He'll verify for you. She looked back at Holt. Can you do this? A beat. Then, and she watched him make the decision, watched it happen in real time in his face, the specific moment when a person stops calculating status and starts calculating what the situation actually requires. He said, yes. Good. She stepped back into the corridor and called Taft. He picked up on the second ring. Where are you? East Corridor. I just received a text from an unknown number to my secondary line. She read it to him verbatim. 11 words, no ID, sent 40 seconds ago. Silence on his end. Not the silence of someone processing, the silence of someone who already knew something and was deciding how much of it to move into the conversation. Taft. Her voice stayed even. What aren't you telling me? Come to the third floor, he said. West stairwell. Now. The stairwell smelled like concrete dust and the particular cold that lived in the parts of buildings that people only moved through rather than occupied. She took it fast, right hand against the railing, the swollen fingers protesting when she gripped, and pushed through the third floor door to find 3 of Taft's team members and a woman she hadn't met yet standing in the corridor outside a server room that had its door propped open with a tactical bag. The woman was late 30s, dark-haired, lean in the way of someone whose fitness was a function of necessity rather than habit. Her left eye was swelling shut around a cut that needed stitches. Her jacket was torn at the right shoulder, and she was holding a tablet with the specific grip of someone who had not let go of it in a long time. She looked at Lena the way people looked at someone they had heard about but not seen. Reyes, Taft said from inside the server room. This is Marsh. Reyes nodded once. Heard you had a busy night. You too. Lena looked at the cut above her eye. That needs to be closed. It needs to wait. Reyes turned the tablet so Lena could see the screen. This is what Harmon was running from up here. Lena looked at the screen. It took her 4 seconds to understand what she was seeing, and then it took her another 2 seconds to understand what it meant, and neither set of seconds was comfortable. It was a network architecture, live, active, branching. A surveillance map of the hospital's interior, rebuilt in real time from sources that were not the hospital's own camera system, which had been taken down at 2:13. These were different feeds, a combination of the personal devices of everyone in the building, phones, tablets, a laptop left open in a break room, accessed through the hospital's guest Wi-Fi network, which had never been secured because hospitals never secured their guest networks, because nobody thought of hospitals as operational targets. Someone had been watching the building through the devices inside it. How long? She asked. Harmon's logs show continuous monitoring from 8 p.m. yesterday, Reyes said. He was providing real-time position updates to the team below. Every time you moved, someone downstairs knew where you were going before you got there. Lena thought about the moments tonight when the team had seemed to anticipate her. The secondary exit, the isolation bay, the vent. She had attributed it to professional competence and standard operational doctrine. It was that. It was also something else. They knew I moved the patient before they found the empty bay, she said. Yes. And they still couldn't get to him. Reyes looked at her. Yes. Taft came out of the server room with a second tablet in his hand and a set of cables disconnected and coiled over his shoulder. Harmon is the operations coordinator. Name is Darrow Finch. 44 years old, former NSA signals intelligence, left under circumstances that were officially described as voluntary separation. I was running communications and position tracking for Reeves' team from this floor all night. He paused. He's currently zip-tied to a server rack. That's the man I secured, Reyes said, without evident satisfaction. He was also the one who sent the text to your phone. Lena looked at her. He had my secondary number. He had everyone's secondary number. That was his job. The surveillance package he ran tonight included a pre-operation intelligence sweep on everyone with potential access to the asset. Reyes paused. Including a former special operations combat medic named Lena Marsh, currently employed as a registered nurse at Hargrove Memorial Hospital, East Wing night shift. She stopped. He flagged you at 9:47 last night as a possible complication. And nobody told the team. Reeve decided you weren't a threat. Reyes's voice was neutral. He was wrong. Lena stood with that for a moment. She had been flagged. She had been assessed. She had been categorized as a possible complication and then downgraded to a non-threat by a man who was currently in zip ties in the lobby, and the specific irony of that was not lost on her, but she set it aside because the text message was still sitting in her hand and it had been sent after Finch was in custody. And that meant something that the three of them standing in this corridor had not yet said out loud. "When did you secure Finch?" she asked Reyes. "Approximately 11 minutes ago." "The text came in 7 minutes ago." The corridor went quiet. Taft said it first. "Finch isn't the only one on the network." "He was running comms," Lena said. "But a network like this doesn't have one node. If he went dark, someone else on the architecture would have noticed." She looked at the tablet Reyes was still holding. "Can you see who else has access to this system?" Reyes was already working it. Her fingers moved across the tablet with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of analysis under worse conditions than a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning. She pulled up a second layer of the network architecture, and Lena watched over her shoulder as the branches resolved into something more specific. Not a single hub-and-spoke system, but a distributed mesh with multiple access points, multiple users, and what appeared to be an automatic alert protocol that had triggered when Finch's connection dropped. "There," Reyes said. She tapped a node on the far right of the architecture. "Active connection, external to the building. The alert went to this address 6 minutes ago, and the node is still live." "Can you locate it?" "Not precisely. The traffic is routed." She paused. "But the routing has a signature. This isn't a professional obfuscation. It's a consumer VPN with a specific exit node pattern that I've seen before." She stopped. "Taft." "I see it." They were looking at each other across Lena in a way that communicated something she was on the outside of. "Tell me," she said. Taft looked at her with the expression of a man choosing between two kinds of honesty. "The exit node pattern matches a communication signature we've been tracking in a separate investigation. Not Reeves' network. Older than Reeves' network. The people who hired Reeve." He paused. "Reeve was a contractor. We knew that. What we didn't know until about 40 seconds ago is that his clients are still operational and they know the drive is here and they know it didn't go with him." "How long have they been watching?" "Since the text. Maybe longer." Lena looked at the tablet, the live node blinking steadily, somewhere outside the building. Someone watching a screen right now, watching the same map that Finch had been running, knowing the team was down, knowing Reeve was in custody, recalculating. "The drive," she said. Taft reached into his jacket and produced it. Still in his possession, she noted, he hadn't passed it to an evidence tech or a secure courier yet. He was looking at it the same way she had looked at it in the isolation bay, small, light, enormously consequential. "If Reeves' clients know it exists and know we have it," she said, "then they know they have approximately—" She looked at Taft. "How long before it reaches federal custody?" "Dawn convoy, 45 minutes. 45 minutes to do something that prevents whatever's on that drive from becoming a federal case." She looked at the blinking node on Reyes's tablet. "They're not going to send another team through the hospital." "No," Taft said. "They're going to try something else." "What do they have?" He was quiet for 2 seconds too long, which was how she knew he had already been thinking about this and had arrived somewhere he didn't want to say. "Taft." "Reeve talked," he said. "In the lobby, while he was being processed. Not everything, not willingly, but enough. His clients have a secondary leverage point." He paused. 3 people connected to Okar's investigation who are not in federal protection, civilian contacts, names, addresses, current locations. The weight of it landed without drama. That was how the worst information usually arrived, quietly, without the soundtrack it deserved. "He's threatening witnesses," she said. "His clients are. Reeve was a triggerman with a nice title. The people above him are still holding the gun." Taft looked at her directly. "We are moving on the addresses. We have people already in transit. But 45 minutes is a long time, and these people are not—" "I know what they are," she said. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing," he said. "You've done enough, more than enough. I need you to—" "Taft." She said it simply. "What do you need?" He looked at her for a moment, not the strategic assessment look she knew from the field, something more like the look of a person who was tired and had been doing hard things for a long time and was standing in front of someone who understood that without needing it, explained. "Finch knows the names," he said. He built the intelligence package. He knows which of the three civilian contacts is the highest priority target and what the contingency protocol is if the operation is compromised. He paused. He hasn't told us. He's been resistant. Resistant, she repeated. He's been in custody for 11 minutes, and he's been quiet for all 11 of them. Taft's voice was level. I'm not asking you to. I know what you're not asking. She handed him back her phone. Keep this. The recording is running, and the file is backed up to a number you have. She looked down the corridor toward the propped open server room door. Give me 5 minutes with him. Marsh, I'm not going to hurt him. I'm going to talk to him. She met Taft's eyes. I'm very good at talking to people, Taft. It's most of what I do. He held her gaze. Then he stepped aside. Darrow Finch was 50 pounds heavier than he looked in the network architecture, the kind of man who had spent 30 years in front of screens and carried it through the middle. He was sitting against the base of a server rack with his wrists secured behind him and his tablet on the floor 3 feet away, powered down. He looked up when she came in, and his assessment of her took approximately 4 seconds. She watched him do it, the professional habit of a surveillance analyst, reading and categorizing. And then he looked back at the floor. NSA, she said. He said nothing. Signals intelligence, voluntary separation. She moved to the far wall and leaned against it, which put her below his eyeline, non-threatening body language, which she had learned mattered more than people thought in conversations where the other person was trying to decide if they were safe. Voluntary is a funny word for being pushed out. What happened? Nothing. You don't have to tell me that either. She looked around the server room, the cables, the rack of equipment, the institutional hum of hardware that had been running all night collecting data about people who hadn't consented to it. You built something sophisticated up here. The guest Wi-Fi pivot was elegant, not original. It's been documented in the literature since 2019. But the implementation was clean. She paused. You did good work for people who were going to let you take the fall regardless of how the night went. A small shift in his posture, barely visible. She filed it. Reeve talked, she said. In the lobby. He's been talking since they put the cuffs on him. He gave them your real name, your NSA history, your exit circumstances. She let that sit. He told them you were the one who designed the surveillance architecture. He said it was your idea to use the guest network. She paused. None of that is true, is it? Finch looked up. He directed the operation, she said. You ran the technical components he specified. There's a difference in terms of legal exposure between the person who conceived and directed an operation and the person who implemented the technical infrastructure under instruction. She kept her voice even. But only if the implementation person has something to offer that the direction person doesn't. His jaw moved. You're not law enforcement. No, I'm a nurse. She looked at him steadily. I'm also the woman who kept the person you were trying to help kill alive for 42 minutes with no weapon and 2 oxygen tanks, so I have a reasonable grasp of working with limited resources. She let that land. 3 civilian witnesses, names, addresses, current locations. Reeves' clients are moving on them right now. If you tell me which of the 3 is the priority target and what the contingency protocol is, we can get there before they do. Finch looked at the floor. I'm not asking for everything, she said. I'm asking for the specific thing that saves a life in the next 20 minutes. Whatever comes after that. She spread her hands. That's between you and the people in the hallway. 12 seconds of silence. Then Finch said, to the floor, Marta Dunn. She's the primary. She's a forensic accountant. She traced the financial transfers that funded 6 years of procurement fraud. Without her testimony, the documentary evidence on the drive is contextualized by defense attorneys as circumstantial. He paused. She's at a residential address in the Whitmore district. She thinks she's in protective custody, but the contact she's been working with... He stopped. Say it, Lena said. The contact she's been working with has been compromised for 8 months. She doesn't know. Lena was already moving for the door. She relayed it to Taft in 30 seconds flat. Dunn, Whitmore district, compromised contact, and watched him put it on the radio before she'd finished speaking. He was already on his phone, clipped and direct. Coordinates relayed, assets redirected. The particular focused efficiency of a senior officer managing multiple crisis threads and refusing to drop any of them. She stood in the corridor and felt the swollen fingers on her right hand and the specific deep ache in her left shoulder that she had not noticed until this moment, the kind of pain that arrived at the invoice stage after the work was done. Her legs were fine, Her head was clear. The shaking in her hands had stopped sometime in the last 20 minutes, and she hadn't noticed when. Down the stairwell and across the east wing and back into the orbit of Hargrove Memorial's slowly normalizing night. Staff emerging from shelter rooms, 2 Calverton PD units pulling into the ambulance bay, a hospital administrator she had never seen before standing at the entrance with a phone pressed to each ear simultaneously. The intercom was running its live all clear on a loop. Someone had brought the lights back to full in the east wing, and the sudden brightness after hours of emergency lighting made everything look briefly unfamiliar, too sharp. The way things looked after your eyes had been somewhere else for a long time. She went back to the isolation bay. Holt was still there. He looked up when she came in, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something about the night, about what he'd seen, about the gap between who he thought she was and what he'd watched her do. Instead, he said, "His pressure stabilized. The neurology attending is on her way in from home." Good. She moved to the gurney, checked the monitor. 66 beats per minute, pressure back in acceptable range. "Did anyone bring the portable imaging unit down here?" "Radiology is setting it up in the corridor." She nodded. She adjusted the dressing on the head wound, rechecked the leads, and stood at the side of the gurney for a moment with nothing to do with her hands. Holt said quietly, "Who is he?" "Someone who did important work for a long time and is going to be okay." She looked at the patient, at Vincent Okar, who still didn't know any of what had happened, who would wake up at some point in the next few hours in a hospital bed with no memory of the drive or the drive's absence or the night shift nurse who had moved him through a dark corridor to keep him alive. "That's all you need." Holt accepted that. It was a different kind of acceptance than she had seen from him before, not the dismissal of someone who didn't care, but the deliberate restraint of someone who was choosing to stay in their lane because they had recognized, finally, where their lane ended and someone else's began. She was going to have to think about what to do with that, eventually, but not right now. Her phone, returned by Taft, buzzed on the counter, a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was Calverton. She picked it up. "This is Marsh." A pause. Then a woman's voice, controlled but tight at the edges. "This is Marta Dunn. Someone just handed me a phone and told me to call this number and that you'd explain what's happening. The person I've been staying with left 20 minutes ago and isn't answering, and I'm alone in this apartment, and there are," a breath, "there are 2 men outside this building. I can see them from the window." "I know," Lena said. "Stay on the phone. Don't open any door. What floor are you on?" "4th. Is there a fire escape on the east-facing wall?" Yes, I think so. The bedroom window." "Go to the bedroom window and tell me what you see outside." A sound of movement through the phone. Lena looked at Taft in the doorway. He had appeared without her hearing him come in, and mouthed "done" and held up 4 fingers. He had his own phone to his ear and nodded, which meant assets were moving. Marta Dunn said, "I see the fire escape. There's a drop to the 3rd floor landing. And, wait." A pause. "There's someone on the 2nd floor landing, below me, coming up." "How fast?" "Fast." Lena did the math. Assets in transit. Whitmore District from the hospital was 7 minutes minimum. The men outside the building had a head start, and the compromised contact who'd left 20 minutes ago had given them the floor and probably the door number. She said, "Marta, I need you to listen to exactly what I say. Are you listening?" "Yes." "The window? Can you open it?" "Yes." "Open it. Don't go out yet. Just open it." A sound of effort through the phone, then a rush of outside air. "Good. Now I need you to make a decision, and I need you to make it in the next 10 seconds. There is a person coming up the fire escape who is not there to help you. There are people coming to help you who are 4 minutes away. 4 minutes is a long time if you're inside and a much shorter time if you're outside. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" A pause. "You want me to go out the window?" "I want you to make your own choice," Lena said. "But if you go out the window and you go up instead of down, you reach the roof in approximately 2 floors, and a roof is a defensible position in a way that a 4th floor apartment is not when someone has the door number." Another pause. Shorter. "Up," Marta Dunn said. "Up," Lena confirmed. The sound of the phone shifting, being pocketed maybe, and then the specific sound of someone climbing, not gracefully, not quietly, the sound of someone moving as fast as they could in the dark, up a fire escape with a phone in their pocket, and everything they'd spent 6 months building on the line. Taft said from the doorway, 3 minutes. We have a unit 2 blocks out. Lena kept the phone in her hand and listened to Marta Dunn climb. She counted the seconds the same way she had counted them all night. Not as a way of managing fear, but because counting was a form of control when everything else was moving too fast to hold. She was good at counting. She was good at staying in the space where the numbers were clean, and the next 10 seconds were the only 10 seconds that mattered. The climbing sound stopped. Then Marta Dunn's voice, breathless, wind in the audio. I'm on the roof. Lena exhaled. Stay low. Stay away from the stairwell access door. If it opens, move away from it. She paused. 3 minutes. Okay. A breath. Okay. In the way, Taft had his phone down and was watching her with an expression she recognized and had not seen directed at her in a long time. It was the expression of someone witnessing a person operate at the level they were actually built for, the specific and rare recognition of watching capability match circumstance without apology or performance. She was aware of it, and she didn't look away from it because she had spent 3 years looking away from things she hadn't been ready to face. His radio crackled. Unit on scene, Whitmore District. Subject located, rooftop. 2 suspects in the building, 3rd floor being engaged. A pause. Subject is secure. The corridor was quiet. Then Reyes, from behind Taft in the doorway. We've got a federal convoy confirmed for the drive. ETD is 22 minutes. She paused. And Taft, Denver field office wants Finch in person. They say what he built up here is the most comprehensive hospital surveillance package they've ever seen, and they want him walking them through it. He'll walk them through it, Taft said. In an interview room. Reyes moved away down the corridor. Taft looked at Lena. She looked back. The message I sent you, he said, earlier, about what comes next. I saw it. And? She looked at the patient on the gurney. She looked at the monitor. 68 beats per minute, pressure stable, the steady green trace of a man alive who had not been alive for certain 6 hours ago. She looked at the broken door on its one hinge and the IV tubing on the floor, and the supply cabinet she had rearranged in the dark by touch. And she thought about 3 years of night shifts and coffee she'd never finished, and a life she had built with her hands out of the deliberate intention to be ordinary. She thought about how good she had been at it. She thought about how easily it had come apart, not because she had failed at it, but because the person she was underneath it had walked into the corridor at 2:09 in the morning and seen a man's boots and known, immediately and without doubt, what they meant. Ask me properly, she said. Not by text. Taft looked at her for a moment. Then he said carefully, the way a person spoke when they were not certain of the answer, but were certain of the question. Lena, the unit that's been running Okar's investigation has a gap now, a specific gap in a specific role that requires someone who can operate in civilian environments without losing the capability to act when it matters. He paused. It also requires someone who can keep a patient alive in a locked room with an oxygen tank and a defibrillator and no backup, which narrows the candidate pool considerably. She said nothing. I'm not asking you to go back to what you were doing before, he said. This is something different, a different structure, different operational parameters. He paused. I'm asking if you want to be the person you actually are, instead of the person you've been trying to be for 3 years. She looked at him. She had an answer. She could feel it, fully formed, sitting at the back of her throat with the specific weight of something she had known for a long time and had been keeping in a room she'd tried to stop visiting. She had known it since the moment at 2:09 when she had looked at a man's boots and felt, underneath the dread, the unmistakable and treasonous clarity of someone doing the thing they were made for. She opened her mouth to say it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number again, different from the last one. She looked at the screen and saw a message that made the answer in her throat go still. 6 words. The drive is not the only copy. She showed Taft the screen. He read it once. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. No sharp intake of breath, no visible alarm. But something behind his eyes went very focused, very fast, the way a lens adjusted when the subject moved. When did Okar send the secondary copy? She asked. He didn't tell us he had one. He wouldn't have, not unless he had a specific reason not to trust the chain. She looked at the phone. Someone who knew about the drive also knew there was a backup, which means this message isn't a threat, it's a disclosure. Taft was already on his radio. Reyes, get back to Finch. Ask him about a secondary data package. Separate from the drive. He'll know what it means. Static. Then Reyes. Copy. Lena set the phone on the counter and looked at the unknown number for another moment. 6 words. Not we have the copy or we'll destroy the copy. Just the fact of its existence, offered without condition. Which meant whoever sent it was not an enemy. Or not entirely. The compromised contact, she said. The one who left Dunn's apartment 20 minutes before the team arrived. You said he'd been turned 8 months ago. According to Finch. But he handed Dunn a phone and told her to call my number. She looked at Taft. A turned asset doesn't do that. A turned asset either stays in place and lets the operation run or extracts themselves clean. They don't hand the target a phone and give them a lifeline. Taft went still. He was running a double, she said. He let Reeves' people think they had him, and he was feeding them just enough to keep them confident while he, what? Built something else. A secondary record. She looked at the phone again. He's the one who sent this. If that's true, find him, she said, before Reeves' clients do. Taft spoke into his radio for 45 seconds straight, clipped and precise, redirecting assets, pulling in a name she didn't have, and a location that Reyes was apparently narrowing from Finch's network logs. She listened to it happen and felt the specific texture of a situation that had been a closed room an hour ago opening into something larger and more complicated and ultimately more complete. She turned back to Vincent Okar. The neurology attending had arrived while she'd been in the stairwell. A woman named Dr. Priya Solis, who had come in from home and had the specific competent irritation of someone called in at 3 a.m, who was nevertheless entirely present. She was reviewing the portable imaging results when Lena came back to the gurney, and she looked up with the expression of a physician who was about to deliver information she was still processing herself. Subdural hematoma, Solis said. Small, right temporal. He's going to need monitoring and probably intervention depending on how the next 6 hours look. She paused. He's also starting to surface. Lena looked at Okar. His eyes were moving under the lids, the specific REM-adjacent movement of someone coming up from deep unconsciousness. His fingers, which had been still all night, were flexing slightly against the gurney rail. Vincent, she said. She kept her voice level and close. You're in Hargrove Memorial Hospital. You're safe. Don't try to sit up. His eyes opened. They were dark brown and initially unfocused, the way eyes looked when the brain behind them was still negotiating its relationship with the external world. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the lights. He looked at Lena. He said, in a voice that sounded like it had been underwater for a long time, the drive. We have it, she said. It's secure. A pause. He was running through something. She could see it in his face, the effort of a man trying to reconstruct a sequence of events from the fragments his memory had managed to hold. The parking structure, he said. They hit the vehicle. I know. You've been here for several hours. The team has been secured. She adjusted the pillow behind his head with her good hand. There's a neurology attending who needs to talk to you when you're ready. Don't rush it. He looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone whose senses were slowly returning to full resolution. Who are you? Lena Marsh. I'm your night shift nurse. Something moved in his face. He looked at the ceiling again, and then back at her and said, You moved me. From the other room. I could hear you talking. I couldn't respond, but I heard it. She thought of herself saying, I don't know if you can hear anything right now into the dark of Bay 4 at 2:17 in the morning to a man she'd known for 30 seconds because she'd learned that the unconscious sometimes heard and it grounded her to say things out loud. Then you know you're okay, she said. Rest. He closed his eyes. Not the deep close of unconsciousness, the deliberate close of a man choosing, for the first time in what was probably a very long time, to let someone else hold the situation for a few minutes. She stepped back from the gurney. Holt was at the door. He had been there for a while, she realized. She'd stopped noticing him specifically because he had stopped requiring to be noticed, which was its own kind of change. He wasn't in the room the way he usually was in a room, filling the center of it by default. He was at the edge of it, and he had been doing the work without commentary, and she owed him the acknowledgement of that, even if she wasn't ready to make it a larger conversation. Thank you, she said. for the patient, and for the surgical prep room, for keeping people in. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was doing the uncomfortable arithmetic of a significant recalibration. I told people you were probably having a breakdown, he said, when you started locking the corridors. I told Darla it was probably a stress response. He paused. I said that out to multiple people. I know. I was wrong. Yes. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone accepting a verdict they'd already delivered to themselves. He stopped. I don't know what I thought you were. Here, these past 3 years. You thought I was a night shift nurse, she said. I was a night shift nurse. Both things can be true. He considered that. Are you going to stay? She looked at Okar on the gurney. She looked at the monitor with its green trace. She looked at the broken door on its single hinge and the IV tubing on the floor and the supply cabinet that still smelled faintly of the pressurized oxygen she'd released into the ceiling duct at 2:40 in the morning. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He accepted that too and walked back to his patient, and she went to find Taft. He was in the lobby. The lobby of Hargrove Memorial at 4:15 in the morning was a different geography than it had been 2 hours before. The tactical team had pulled back to a staging position in the ambulance bay. 2 federal agents in civilian clothes had arrived and were managing the transfer of Reeve, who was sitting in a chair against the far wall with his wrists secured and his composure still largely intact in the way of someone who had decided that composure was the only asset he had left and was going to maintain it until he ran out of reasons. A 3rd federal agent was talking to Darla Frick, who had emerged from wherever she'd sheltered during the lockdown, looking like someone whose understanding of the last 3 hours was approximately 20% complete and who was not handling the gap well. Lena watched Reeve as she crossed the lobby. He saw her coming and he watched her cross, and his face stayed neutral until she was close enough that neutral became a choice rather than a default. And then something shifted. Not remorse, not fear. Something more like the reluctant acknowledgement of a professional who had been beaten by something he hadn't adequately accounted for. You had 7 people, she said, stopping in front of him. I did. And a surveillance network running since 8 p.m., and a compromised contact and a 30-year operational record. She looked at him. And you still lost the drive. He said nothing for a moment, then, I underestimated the variable. Most people do, she said. It's a consistent problem. She left him there and found Taft near the exterior doors. The double, she said. Did you find him? We found him. Taft's voice had something in it she hadn't heard all night. Not relief exactly, more like the release of sustained pressure. Name is Aldrich Voss. He's been embedded in Reeve's client network for 14 months, parallel to Okar's operation, completely siloed, which is why neither of them knew about the other. He paused. The secondary copy is a cloud archive he built over 6 months. Financial records, communications, the same documentary evidence as the drive, but with 6 additional months of data on top of it. Reeve's clients have been operating continuously. The drive was point in time. Voss's archive is current. She absorbed that. Where is he? Coming in. He's been running mobile for 3 hours. He went to ground when the operation broke, and he's been waiting to see if we were who we said we were before he surfaced. Taft looked at her. He sent you the message because Okar had your number in his contact list flagged as emergency protocol. Voss accessed Okar's phone when they were in the parking structure, and he used the flag when he didn't know who else to trust. Okar had my number flagged. Under the name he had for you, Taft said. Not Marsh. Your operational call sign. He paused. He knew who you were when they brought him in. He knew you were here. She thought about a man going under anesthesia or unconsciousness, or both in the back of an ambulance, knowing where he was being taken, hearing a voice in the dark saying, I know who you are, and choosing, somewhere beneath the reach of conscious decision, to let it be enough. The clients, she said, Reeve's clients, with the archive and the drive, both. Federal warrants are being executed at 4 addresses as of about 8 minutes ago, Taft said. The archive gave us current operational data, locations, accounts, personnel. We've been building toward this for 6 years, he paused. Tonight accelerated the timeline by approximately 18 months. She looked at him. Because of what happened here. Because of what you did here. Yes. The exterior doors opened and two of Taft's team members came in with a man between them who looked like someone who had been running on no sleep and sustained anxiety for a long time and had just been told he could stop. Aldrich Voss was 41, slight, with the hollow-cheeked look of someone who had spent more than a year eating badly and sleeping in places that weren't designed for sleeping. He was still holding his phone. He looked around the lobby until his eyes found Lena, and he crossed to her directly, before Taft, before anyone else. "You're Marsh," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Okar told me once, before the parking structure, before everything went wrong, he said if it ever went sideways, there was a name I should find. A person." He paused. "He said you were the best he'd ever worked with, and that if the situation was bad enough to need you, you'd already be handling it." She stood with that for a moment. She wasn't sure what to do with it, which was unusual. She was generally good at knowing what to do with information. "Is he alive?" Voss asked. "He woke up 20 minutes ago," she said. "He's going to need surgery, but he's going to be okay." Voss exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhalation. It was the specific sound of a very tired person releasing something they had been holding for a very long time. And it was quiet and private, and she looked away to give it room. The rest of the night moved in the particular rhythm of aftermath. The cleanup that came after the acute thing was done, which was its own kind of work and required its own kind of stamina. Federal agents processed the lobby. Taft's team completed their sweep of every floor. Darla Frick, who had been trying for 40 minutes to understand what jurisdiction covered her charge nurse station, was eventually guided to a chair by one of the Calverton PD officers who arrived and was given coffee and a patient explanation that she was going to receive a lot of phone calls over the next several days. Lena did her vitals rounds. She did them because it was 4:30 in the morning and she was still on shift and her patients needed their vitals checked, and because the ordinariness of it was not something to flee from, but something to come back to deliberately, with both hands open. She checked pressures and temperatures and respiratory rates, and she documented everything in the system with her left hand, because the right was now properly splinted. A surgical resident named Dara Ose had found her at 4:20 and insisted, with the specific gentle forcefulness of someone who had been told who Lena was and was trying to do something useful, and Lena had let her. 2 fractures, 3rd and 4th proximal phalanges. Stable, non-displaced. Ose had been careful and efficient and had taped them with a kind of focused attention that felt like its own form of acknowledgement. At 5:10, the federal convoy left with the drive and a secure copy of Voss's archive, and Marcus Reeve and Darrow Finch and 4 other people who had been found in various states of securing throughout the building. The convoy was not dramatic. No sirens, no visible urgency, just 3 vehicles moving out of the ambulance bay into the early morning dark with the contained purpose of people who had a long day of work still ahead of them. Lena stood at the east wing window and watched it go. She heard Taft behind her. Not his footsteps specifically. She recognized his presence the way you recognized anyone you had spent years working closely with, the particular combination of sound and displaced air and peripheral motion that resolved into a specific person without requiring a look. "They'll be processed before noon," he said. "Reeves' clients, the 4 addresses. Combined with the archive and the drive, the federal case is the strongest I've seen in 20 years. He paused. "It's done." "Is it?" "The operational threat is done. The legal process is going to take time, but the people who sent that team into this building tonight are going to spend the rest of their working lives in courtrooms, and most of what comes after that will be spent somewhere with restricted movement." He paused. "Okar's testimony alone. He'll testify?" "He told Dr. Solis about an hour ago that he wanted to speak with a federal attorney as soon as medically permitted." Taft's voice was quiet. "He also asked about you. Specifically, he asked if you were all right." She looked at the window. The sky outside was doing the thing it did in the last 40 minutes before actual sunrise. Not lightning yet, not quite, but shifting in its quality, the darkness becoming less absolute, a change you felt more than saw. "I want to tell you something," Taft said, "and I want you to let me finish before you say anything." She turned. He looked older in this light than he did in her memory of him, which was 3 years old and came from a context where both of them had been younger in ways that had nothing to do with age. There were lines in his face that hadn't been there before. and a tiredness in his eyes that she recognized as the particular fatigue of someone who had been doing important, invisible work for a long time without adequate acknowledgement of the cost. "When you left," he said, "I didn't fight it. I thought you were running, and I let you run because I thought maybe you needed to. Because the last 18 months before you separated were," he paused, "they were too much. Even for you. Especially for you, because people like you don't usually let anyone see how much it costs." He looked at her directly. "I should have said something, 3 years ago, before you signed anything. I should have found a different way to ask you to stay." The lobby was quiet enough that she could hear the HVAC system cycling. "I didn't leave because of the cost," she said. "I left because I stopped trusting my own judgment, after Mosura." A place name she hadn't said aloud in 3 years, and it landed in the room with the particular weight of something that had been carried a long way. "I made a call that killed 2 people and saved 11, and I couldn't figure out how to keep making calls after that. I kept seeing the 2. "You made the right call," Taft said. "I know that now." She looked at him. "I knew it then, technically. But knowing something technically and knowing it in the place where you make decisions are different things, and I needed time to move it from one place to the other." She paused. "Tonight helped." He let that sit without filling it. "The offer," he said eventually. "It stands. It's not contingent on tonight. It's not a reward. It's not something I'm saying because you saved a federal asset and a drive and a witness and an entire hospital's worth of civilian staff. It stands because the role exists and you're the right person for it, and you've been the right person for it for 3 years while you were doing something else." He paused. "But it's your choice. It has to be your choice." She thought about the drive in her pocket, the weight of it, which she had barely felt, the specific and peculiar fact that she had spent 6 hours defending something she couldn't see and didn't fully understand, on behalf of a man she'd known for 40 minutes, and a process she had no official standing in, using tools that were a decade out of date, and instincts she'd been pretending she'd lost. And she had not once, not in the isolation bay, not in the corridor, not standing in front of Marcus Reeve in the lobby with her hand swelling and her legs starting to give, she had not once thought about stopping. That was the information. That was the thing she'd been trying to avoid knowing for 3 years and had known anyway. "Yes," she said. Taft looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "The answer is yes, but I have conditions." "Tell me." "I stay registered. I keep my nursing license current. If there is ever a situation where the work and the patients conflict, the patients come first. Non-negotiable." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going back to the person I was before I left. I'm going forward as the person I am now, and that person is a nurse who has other skills, not the other way around." Taft held her gaze. Then he nodded. "Done." "And I want to see Mosura declassified," she said. "The full record. Not what was in the summary. The decision chain, the intelligence picture, the outcome assessment. I want to see the whole thing, once, on paper, and then I want it put somewhere I can find it if I need it." She paused. "I need to know the whole story, not just the part I was in." He was quiet for a moment. "I can do that." "Then yes," she said. "My answer is yes." The exterior doors opened and the cold morning air came through them. Real cold now, the specific cold of the hour before dawn, carrying the smell of wet concrete and the distant suggestion of traffic beginning somewhere in the city. At 6:04 a.m., Hargrove Memorial Hospital's normal morning shift began to arrive. They came in through the main entrance the way they always did. Coffee cups, badge swipes, the specific low-frequency energy of people who had slept and were now preparing for a long day. They found a lobby that looked approximately normal if you didn't look too carefully at the scuff marks near the exterior doors or the small evidence marker the federal team had left by the East Wing junction and forgotten to retrieve. They found their colleagues coming off a night shift that no one had fully explained yet. Lena was at the East Wing nurses' station when the day shift charge nurse, a man named Ferris who she'd worked alongside for 2 years without ever having a real conversation, stopped at the station and looked at her splinted hand and the general condition of her scrubs, which were not in the state they'd been at the start of the shift, and said, "Rough night?" "Eventful," she said. "I heard there was some kind of... The police were here?" "Federal, mostly." She finished her documentation. "Everything's been handled. The patients are stable. She looked up at him. Bay 4 in the East Isolation Room will need detailed briefings. I've left notes. The neurology attending Dr. Solis has the lead on Bay 4. Don't let anyone discharge or transfer him without Solis's sign-off and federal authorization. Ferris looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who understood that he was receiving about 15% of the available information and was deciding whether to ask for more. Okay, he said. She filed her final documentation, signed off on the shift handover, and walked out of the East Wing. She was in the corridor outside the main stairwell when Darla Frick intercepted her. Darla looked like someone who had spent the last several hours having her professional model of reality revised against her will, and had arrived at the other side of the revision somewhere between exhausted and genuinely uncertain, which were not states Lena had ever seen her occupy simultaneously. "Marsh," she said, and then stopped. Lena waited. "The lockdown protocol," Darla said. "The shelter in place, the patient transfer." She paused. "I told you to go do your vitals check." "You did." "If you had listened to me—" She stopped again. She was working through it in real time, Lena could see. The specific, uncomfortable calculation of a person mapping their own decisions against an outcome they hadn't anticipated. "I told you you were acting like you were in the military." Dr. Holt said something similar. Darla looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has just had the experience of discovering that a person they had thoroughly categorized was not in the category. It was an uncomfortable expression. Lena had seen it on a number of faces tonight, and she had not enjoyed it any of the times. "Were you?" Darla asked. "In the military." "For a while," Lena said. "Yes." "And now?" Lena looked at her. She thought about the answer she'd given Taft 40 minutes ago. She thought about the conditions she'd set, which were not performative conditions. They were the actual terms of who she was and how she intended to operate going forward, without apology, without the 3-year performance of smallness that she had constructed out of the belief that it was necessary and had gradually discovered was simply a habit. "Now I'm a nurse," she said. "Who has other skills?" She paused. "I'll be back on shift Thursday." Darla blinked. "You're coming back." "I like this job," Lena said. "I'm good at it. The patients here are my responsibility, and I take that seriously." She held Darla's gaze for a moment. "I'd appreciate it if we could operate from that going forward, rather than from whatever we've been operating from for the past 3 years. Darla opened her mouth, closed it, then said, with the stiff honesty of someone who was not used to having to excavate this particular register, "I misjudged you." "You did," Lena said. "It happens." She paused. "Thursday." She walked out. The ambulance bay was empty of federal vehicles. The morning was gray and cool, and the sky above Calverton had achieved the specific quality of light that came in the 15 minutes before actual sunrise. Not warm yet, not golden, but no longer dark. Everything was the color of slate and potential. She stood in the ambulance bay for a moment. Her right hand ached through the splinting, a steady pulse of complaint from the fractured fingers that was going to be her constant companion for the next 4 to 6 weeks. Her left shoulder had stiffened during the shift handover and was going to have something to say about that for a few days. She was tired in the way she got when she had been operating beyond her body's preferred parameters for an extended stretch. Not the collapse kind of tired, but the deep structural tired that required sleep and food and time and the particular rest of not being needed urgently. She was also more awake than she had been in 3 years. That was the thing she was going to have to sit with. The fact that 6 hours of the worst night Hargrove Memorial had ever had were also, honestly, the most fully present she had been since she drove away from the base housing with her boxes in the back of her truck and told herself she was choosing peace. She had chosen something. Whether it was peace or something that merely resembled it was a question that had taken 3 years to answer, and the answer had come at 2:09 in the morning in the form of a man wearing the wrong boots. She didn't feel good about that. She didn't feel bad about it either. She felt it the way she felt most true things, with the specific discomfort of clarity, which was not comfortable but was at least honest. Taft came through the ambulance bay doors behind her. He stood beside her in the gray morning and didn't say anything for a moment, which was one of the things she had always respected about him. His comfort with silence, his refusal to fill space just because it was empty. "Voss is going to need support," he said eventually. "Long term. He's been under for 14 months, and the decompression process is, I know what it is, she said. I'll talk to him. And Okar, when he's recovered, I'll be here when he wakes up properly. She looked at the sky. I'm on Thursday. Taft was quiet. The people who get forgotten, she said. That's what tonight was about. Not the drive, not the network, not the case that's going to take 3 years to move through federal court. It was about the person in Bay 4 who nobody was going to find in time. It was about Dunn on a rooftop making a decision with 30 seconds to act. It was about Voss in the dark for 14 months doing work that nobody was supposed to know about. She paused. People do enormous things in invisible places, and the world mostly doesn't see it. And when something goes wrong, the person who's been quiet and careful and present in the right place at the right time gets treated like a surprise. She paused. I'm tired of being a surprise. Taft looked at her. I'm going to stop being modest about what I am, she said. Not in a way that announces itself, just, I'm going to stop apologizing for the space I take up in rooms where the people who take up the most space have been wrong about the important things. She looked at him. I spent 3 years being easy to overlook because I thought it was polite. It wasn't. It was a waste. He said quietly. Yes, it was. The sun came up, not dramatically. There was no clean horizon line over Calverton, just the gray dissolving into something warmer, the light thickening gradually from the east until the parking lot and the ambulance bay and the flat face of Hargrove Memorial were all the same dull gold of an ordinary morning. Cars were moving on the street beyond the hospital perimeter. A food delivery truck was double parked at the loading bay of the building across the street. An early jogger went past on the sidewalk, headphones in, oblivious. The world was doing what the world always did, which was to continue. She stood in it, fractured fingers, borrowed clarity, a conversation she'd agreed to that was going to change the shape of the next several years of her life. And she felt the specific quality of a moment that was not an ending and not a beginning, but the hinge between them, where you stood and took a full breath and chose the direction of the next step with your eyes open. She had been overlooked. She had been managed and dismissed and categorized as decorative and moved past and told to go do her vitals check. She had been underestimated by people with titles and offices and 30-year operational records and 7 armed professionals and a surveillance network that had watched her every move since 8 p.m. All of them, at various points in the last 6 hours, had been wrong about her in ways that had cost them dearly. She did not feel triumphant about that. Triumph was for people who had been fighting for recognition. She had not been fighting for recognition. She had been doing the work, the actual work, the specific and unglamorous and quietly essential work of being the person in the right place with the right training and the willingness to use it at the right moment. And recognition was what happened when the work was too large to ignore. It had always been enough to do the work. It had just taken a very long night to remember that. She picked up her bag from where she'd set it on the ambulance bay railing. She looked at Taft once. Thursday, she said. And you owe me the Mosura file. You'll have it by Wednesday. She walked to her car. She drove home through the early morning streets of Calverton with the window down and the cold air moving through the car and the radio off. She did not think about the next thing. She thought about sleep and food and the specific physical relief of lying flat after a long time vertical. She thought about a man on a gurney hearing a voice in the dark and choosing to trust it. She thought about what it meant to be capable of something and spend years pretending otherwise, and what it cost, and what you got back when you finally stopped. She turned onto her street. The quiet was the same quiet it had always been. Early morning residential, birds, a sprinkler running somewhere, the particular stillness of a neighborhood that didn't know what had happened 6 miles away in a hospital with a broken door. It was ordinary and real, and she had built it deliberately, and it was hers, and none of what she had agreed to in the ambulance bay changed that. She had learned something in the last 6 hours that she was going to carry for a long time, that the people who are treated as invisible are not invisible. They are simply surrounded by people who have not yet learned to look. And when the moment comes, when the crisis arrives that no one else is prepared for, when the corridor goes dark and the door breaks and the patients need someone to stand between them and the worst thing, the invisible ones are already in position. They were always already in position. They just don't get the credit until the night no one saw coming finally shows the world exactly who was there all along. Lena Marsh pulled into her driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the quiet